In this video, we're going to be looking at Sherry's garden. Sherry's my neighbor, and actually this is what I consider to be my primary garden. This is the garden that I've been working with the longest. And we'll look at some of the things I'm doing through the lens of the Soils in Sync infographic. So let's dive in. Westone here with Soils in Sync. Check out the full intro to the Soils in Sync infographic and soil health principles in the video I have linked in the description. Tickle that like button, subscribe, heck it's free, and let us know your experience in the comments because we're all here just trying to learn together. Enjoy this tour. So this garden is located along the shores of Lake Superior in the far north woods of Wisconsin. We get about 32 inches of rain per year. The growing season is only about 115 to 120 days between frosts. So it's a very short growing season. You can just about grow cool season crops all year. Warm season crops barely have enough of a window to fully produce. On a bad year, they might not produce. And you can see that background ecology is what we call the North Woods or the Northern Great Lakes Forest. And the climate is very much tempered by Lake Superior. We do get some lake effect snow. We get about double the snow that, most of what Minnesota would get. So I'll actually start on the outside of the garden. In an effort to keep grass and weeds from creeping in, I like to put about a foot out and maybe a few inches deep of sawdust. Sawdust actually works the best, but you can use leaves, you can use wood chips, whatever you can get a hold of. And this works because grass really likes to grow in this range here. And by smothering that grass with tree leaves, as I said, sawdust works the best. You could use cardboard paper. You could use any high carbon material that you can get a hold of. And this works because grass feeds on nitrogen. Grass feeds on manure. Grass does not like a high carbon environment. So not only do you smother the grass with a few inches of carbon, but you also change the soil chemistry to a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than grass prefers. And if you really want to be effective, if you've got really prolific grass, what you could do is actually till the outside of your fence and till in sawdust, because where that carbon is making contact with the soil is going to be nitrogen deficient. So if you're just putting sawdust on top of the grass, there's only a thin layer between those two mediums where it may be nitrogen deficient. But if you really have strong, prolific grass, high nitrogen soils, you could till in sawdust, and that would really rob the grass of the nitrogen that it wants. My soil here is incredibly infertile, so it's really easy to smother out this grass. Inside the garden here, I like to put a narrow bed that's about 12 or 18 inches wide because that allows me to grow peas and beans along the fence without having to put in an extra trellis, so it's just very efficient. So I plant peas in this bed along the fence, and then I like to grow spinach next to that. Spinach will benefit from the nitrogen that the peas produce and the beans produce, and that allows me to be able to put minimal fertilizer in this particular bed or minimal compost in this particular bed. My soils naturally fall in this range here, and so legumes grow really well, and they'll also provide nitrogen, which will set the soil ecosystem back to provide extra nitrogen for the spinach, which will do better with legumes as a companion. Unfortunately, the trees like to drop their leaves in my garden, so I do have kind of a leaf litter problem around the edges that kind of tends to smother stuff, so that's a bit of an inconvenience. In my main vegetable beds like this one here, I just use a compost that I make myself. The materials in my context that I can get in abundance are tree leaves. I have a neighbor guy who's pretty meticulous about his lawn, and he lives in a very wooded lot. So he gets a ton of tree leaves. He mows them in his machine. Those turn to leaf mulch. And then he just he just drives down the road and drops them off right next to my garden. So God bless you, Bob. It makes gathering carbon and organic matter very, very easy for me. So tree leaves are kind of my base, and I get tree leaves in abundance because of my context of living in the forest ecosystem, the background ecology of the Northwoods. Nitrogen is my bottleneck. It's very difficult to overwinter animals in my area, so therefore nitrogen is a bottleneck, and therefore my ability to grow certain things is constrained by my ability to procure nitrogen. One source of nitrogen that I have been able to procure in at least consistent quantities is coffee grounds. So I can make a good compost where I mix that with my tree leaves, and if you notice, they combine pretty well to balance out into that 30-to-1 ratio. So tree leaves and coffee grounds are a pretty big part of my composting regimen. Being that I live in the Northwoods, wood chips are also pretty easy to procure, and they're generally free. But those are way too high in carbon for my vegetable bed. They've got about a 200 or 300 to 1 carbon and nitrogen ratio. So to offset that, one thing I've started doing due to a shortage of nitrogen is a urine composting toilet. Very easy, very simple to do, very safe. If you pour that over top of your wood chip pile, over time you will create a nice compost, but it does take a little bit of extra time. And you can see they balance out very nicely in that vegetable range. So that compost that I make is what I use on my vegetable beds. I want that 30-to-1 carbon and nitrogen ratio finished compost for seeding carrots, parsnips, beets, things that I can't really mulch. In this bed this year I'm growing potatoes. So first I put down my compost, and then I mulched it with leaves because potato plants can easily push through those leaves, and this just helps conserve some of the moisture and add some slow fertility throughout the season. Here's just another regular vegetable bed with that 30-to-1 finished compost. The bad thing about this garden is that it has raspberries and blackberries growing right in the middle of it. And if you know anything about them, they'll spread and take over. So I'm constantly having to prune roots that are trying to grow into my vegetable beds. The only thing I do with these, I do not apply any nitrogen, urine, coffee grounds. I only put leaves on the raspberries. And here's Ezekiel Brown. Here's the row of raspberries in the middle of the garden. As I said, these only get mulched with leaves. No other fertilizers or compost. That's because raspberries and blackberries vertically align with your tree leaves, your straw. So there's no need to add anything other than these materials to your raspberries. If you're already starting with very high nitrogen soils that say grow a lot of grass, then you could probably benefit from adding wood chips to your raspberries, because you can see how now if your soil has a 25-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio and you need to shift it to 60 to 80-to-1, well, now you can see how adding some wood chips might be beneficial and balance out. My soils, however, are already naturally probably in that 40 or 50-to-1 range, so all I have to do is add tree leaves to the raspberries, and the carbon and nitrogen ratios align pretty easily. Got another bed here. There's another vegetable bed here. Depending on what I'm growing, for instance, in this bed here, I've got peas and beans along the fence, so I've got a boost of nitrogen here. I'm growing some brassicas. These are actually rutabagas. They'll benefit somewhat from the peas and beans that are constantly growing here. And also, I will add a supplemental nitrogen boost to those rutabagas in the form of urine from the urine composting toilet. This is the single best nitrogen fertilizer that's free, abundant, safe, effective, and easy. So because I have sandy soils, these do not like to hold nitrates. Nitrates like to leach. I do have to add some nitrogen supplement periodically depending on what I'm growing. I generally won't do that with carrots because carrots like to be over here, your legumes, raspberries, blackberries. This is kind of the range where my garden soil likes to be. So it's actually quite difficult for me in this garden to grow stuff over here. Nitrates are produced in that high bacterial, high nitrogen soil, and nitrates are what feed these crops and what feed your weeds and whatnot. There's this natural dynamic where rain will leach those nitrates from the sandy soil and favor those later successional crops. So if I want to grow anything in this range, I have to be adding manure or urine or some nitrogen source 2-3 times per season. I tend to just go with the path of least resistance and grow stuff with a little bit higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. So if we walk back into this corner here, there are 4 blueberry plants. These used to be kind of all over the garden, and we dug them up and moved them back here just 2 years ago. And these, the one in the corner here is the biggest, nicest one, probably the oldest one. But these have been here for a very long time, maybe 10 years, and they just really have not grown or produced hardly at all. But 2 years ago, when we moved these, I did add wood chips to them and prune them a little bit. And this one in the corner is one that did not get transplanted, so it remained established where it was. And the regrowth on this thing has been really impressive. So I'm hoping that now this year, after having moved these other ones, they'll be established by now. They'll benefit from that wood chip mulch, and they'll start to produce more significantly. Again, blueberries, they like that acidic soil, and the way that we acidify the soil is by adding a high carbon material, such as mixed arborist wood chips. And specifically pine. Up where I live, blueberries actually do grow in the wild because of the naturally acidic soils, the pine forests, and whatnot. So I try to get a shredded up pine tree for my wood chip mulch. That's exactly what I've got here in this corner. You can see those pine needles, wood chips in there. This is just ideal stuff for your blueberries. And that's it. No other supplementation, no other nothing, just the wood chips and whatever leaves happen to blow over in that corner. Again, blueberries prefer that high carbon to nitrogen ratio, high fungal environment, low soil pH, acidic soil. We shift that by simply adding whatever vertically aligns with it. Here's some of the crop I've grown from the past few years. These are Chantenay red cord carrots, so they're a wide, fat carrot. I'm going to move away from that variety because my soils will let me grow longer, skinnier carrots. Some of these carrots are about the size of my forearm. And you can see these rutabagas are pretty pathetic here. And I think that kind of demonstrates that carbon to nitrogen ratio because, yeah, if my soils are in this range here, that's not to say that I can't grow brassicas, but those brassicas are not going to thrive, right? My soils are set up to grow these carrots, and when your soils are in sync with your crop's preference, that's when you get phenomenal results. Now, one year, I had gotten cattle manure from the local dairy, and that was the only amendment that I put on the garden. No carbon, just pure composted cattle manure. And that year, I grew phenomenal brassicas. Here you can see just how massive that kale got. And that's because the soils were in sync, right? We had probably a 20-to-1, 25-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, and brassicas, kale, thrives on that manure. The following year, I had stupidly put too many wood shavings on my garden, and I thought I could grow that wonderful kale again. But what I had done is I had shifted the soil carbon to nitrogen ratio so far in this direction with those wood chips and sawdust, and that sawdust ended up kind of almost getting stirred into the soil, which is even worse because then you're robbing nitrogen even deeper into the soil. And for 2 years after that, I could not even grow brassicas. Those brassicas would sit there for about 2 months stagnant before those roots finally got below that high carbon zone in the soil, and then they finally started to grow. But that same year, I grew phenomenal carrots. And the carrots are not woody. They're very sweet, tender all the way through. I do my best to obey the soil health principles, the first being keeping the soil covered. So on the pathways, I keep the soil covered with mulch. That helps to preserve some moisture. That serves a lot of different purposes. But the main concern is the beds. You can see this bed here, which is seeded with lettuce and carrots. The lettuce is grown quite intensively so that when it reaches mid to mature stage, the canopy closes and there's no wasted sunlight in the bed. There's a patch here that looks like maybe I just harvested a few. The goal is to close all those gaps and to capture as much solar energy as possible. In this bed over here to the left, this bed was a new bed that this garden was a really weird shape before, so it may not make sense, but this whole bed was new, and this bottom half of this bed was also new. So rather than try to grow a crop in there, this stuff is pretty infertile, kind of virgin clay almost. I put some compost. You can see some coffee grounds in there, but I figured I would just sacrifice that year for a better harvest the following year. So that's what I did. I grew peas and oats in these two spots, and as we'll see in a minute here, those produced a really nice cover that fed the soil, kept the soil covered, and it's really satisfying to see these areas of the beds be covered by green instead of brown. Learn to hate to see your soil. You never want to see your soil if you can help it. Here's one of those beds with the peas and oats cover. Very deep, lush, beautiful, thick greenery. Here's a different bed. You can see that squash plant over here. And it's also overtaking my pathway. So I'm capturing as much solar energy in this plot as I possibly can. You can also see the lettuce. Once the lettuce was harvested, the carrots came up later that year and were planted densely enough to capture all of the sunlight that fell in this square. Here's a different view. You can see a little bit better. The next soil health principle, minimizing soil disturbance. I do not till this garden. It really doesn't even need to be tilled. The only tillage I do is when I harvest carrots, parsnips, and potatoes, because there's obviously built-in disturbance in harvesting those crops. One thing I failed to mention is that a key part of my fertility program is vermicompost. I have a small vermicomposting system in my basement, and there's a wide variety of inputs to that vermicomposting system, so there's diversity embedded within that compost. I do some level of crop rotation, but not really intentionally. And I don't think I would need to do crop rotation given my diverse composting regimen. Next principle, using natural material. All of my inputs are natural materials. One time I inherited some phosphorus, potassium, synthetic fertilizer, and because I was lacking organic matter and lacking fertility, I decided I'd just give it a try just because I figured it was better than nothing. So I did put some high pK fertilizer on the raspberries. Phosphorus and potassium help with fruiting and flowering. It did help with the fruit, but the fruit tasted horrible. The fruit tasted artificial. It was not sweet. It tasted like the chemicals I put on it. So I will never do that again. That took about 2 years for that flavor to go away from my raspberries after I just started mulching them with leaves exclusively. And the final principle, knowing your context. We've already talked some about that, about which resources are available to me. This is a very big subject that is worth thinking deeply about. If this video helped grow your soils, You can help grow the channel by doing these things, and tell your friends and family about it too. If not, add a dislike, but at least tell me why so I can improve. Westone here, see you in the next one.